Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Today, I have the honor of speaking with Matthew Mitchell, a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Matt has had a great influence on me over the past years since I have turned to him many times for many ideas for papers and other data that I've needed in research that I've done. Thank you, Matt, and welcome to my podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. The honor's mine.
Before I start, I want to ask you a question I ask all my guests. What is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Well, I wouldn't put it on your generation. I wouldn't imply that your generation is particularly lacking in knowing this, but I would say that there's something I would want everybody to know and to think about. And what I would say is that's a distinction between thinking about what is and what ought to be. And it seems like a pretty simple idea, but in my experience, a lot of people miss this nuance. So, when people say something like, gosh, I look at the evidence and I believe that a minimum wage is going to increase unemployment among the young and unskilled. And somebody else hearing that might say, oh my gosh, you're opposed to the minimum wage. Why do you not want to see, those who are least well off among us better? And, that's just such an odd way to interpret that statement. And if you dig a little deeper, I think what's going on there is that people are confusing what is with what ought to be. And if we're clear about the way, when we're making statements about the way we think the world works, versus when we're making statements about how the way it ought to work, I think we're going to avoid a whole lot of misunderstandings, and we're not going to talk past one another quite so much as we do. So when I usually start classes, I start with the premise that people are confusing or are not being very clear about statements of what is and what ought to be. So I'd say that's the first thing.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think a lot of people have to have that, should have that in mind more often when faced with having these sorts of conversations, because that would lead to a lot more constructive conversation, a lot more learning in the conversational process of exploring topics. So,
right.
Moving on to cronyism and government privilege and stuff. So you are one of the most renowned scholars on the issue of cronyism and corporate welfare. You call it government-granted privilege or government favoritism. Can you tell us what cronyism is, and can you give us a few examples?
Sure. So, the term cronyism goes back actually to the Latin for chronos, for time. And it's basically the idea that you're going to favor or privilege your chums and those with whom you go back a long time. I actually don't love the term cronyism because in that sense, it's not necessarily a bad thing, although it can be. We favor our friends. We favor our friends' advice on dating, on job recommendations, on movie recommendations, right? There's nothing wrong with that. The real problem comes when those sort of connections begin to influence public policy, where governments are favoring particular firms or industries or people on the basis of connections. But I would also point out that governments don't only favor on the basis of connections. They'll also favor firms, industries, or occupations on the basis of other factors. For example, they may favor one firm over another due to political action PAC donations, sorry, political action committee donations, or they may favor one group over another because they're just politically correct. Farmers and small businesses, they benefit from all sorts of favors, whether or not they know anybody in government. So to me, the real issue, the real problem is favoritism. It's different rules applying to different groups of people based on any number of factors, but the real problem is favoritism itself.
So, a few years ago, you wrote a paper that was called The Pathology of Privilege, the Economic Consequences of Government Favoritism. And you write, quote, whatever its guise, government granted privilege to private businesses is an extraordinarily destructive force. It misdirects resources, impedes genuine economic process, breeds corruption, and undermines the legitimacy of both the government and the private sector, end quote. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. So my general argument is that there are a whole lot of negative consequences that arise when governments pick winners and losers or favor particular firms or industries or occupations. So some of them are just purely economic costs. If you favor one firm over others, you're likely to invite some anti-competitive effects. That those firms are able to ignore customers. They're able to have higher costs than they otherwise would because they're protected from competition. And you're going to potentially misdirect resources. You're going to channel labor and capital into those favored industries over, maybe where customers want them or where costs and benefits say that they ought to go. But beyond that, I think there's also some sort of a cultural cost to this. So when people see the government favoring particular firms or industries, they get a jaundiced view of government and of democracy, and they start to think that we government's purpose is not to serve the general welfare, but to serve the specific welfare of particularly sympathetic interest groups. And I think that has a corrosive effect, on democracy. I'm a big James Madison fan, and if you go to, I know you're a Hamilton musical fan, so sorry to stir up anything here, but Madison's, I would argue the most important Federalist paper is Federalist 10, and in it he is making a plea to try to stop the politics of faction and find some way to devise institutions that don't favor particular firms or groups. And I think he was spot on. There's a reason why that's one of the most celebrated works in political science in U.S. history. So it undermines government, but I also think it undermines the legitimacy of markets as well. So when people see that some firms seem to sink or swim on the basis of their connections with government, they start to get a jaundiced view not only of government but also of markets, and they start to think markets aren't they don't exist necessarily to please consumers. They exist to please politicians. And so I really think it has, over particularly over the long term, a really corrosive effect on all sorts of aspects of society.
I interviewed Chris Edwards a few days ago about wealth inequality. And one of the few things that he said, one of the few instances where he thinks that wealth inequality is a real issue is when it is the product of cronyism and government intervention specifically. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I absolutely do. Wealth inequality can arise from a number of different ways. Some of it is sort of natural. If you happen to do a better job of creating value for other people, those people will reward you with more dollars. And if you can do it in a way marrying up with technology that allows you to reach lots and lots of people, then all the better. So, that's why basketball stars are able to earn so much more than the rest of us, because they do something pretty extraordinary that a lot of customers are willing to pay them for, but they do it in a way that through the miracle of modern technology can create value for millions upon millions of people all around the world. So to me, I'm not so disturbed or worried about that. But, like Chris, I do worry about gross inequality that can come about from uh, unequal rules or an uneven playing field. Um, you know, the of course the most stark example of this in world history is slavery. Slavery is nothing but a system of government granted privilege to particularly well connected or sympathetic groups like Southern landed gentry that ends up harming those who are disfavored. So, and of course, I think there is some truth to the idea that many modern African Americans are continuing to live with the legacy of that favoritism from several centuries ago. So, in less stark and not quite so terrible terms, I do think that there continues to be some inequality and inequities that from current public policy. Everything from several decades of bailouts to too big to fail firms, to privileges for certain types of healthcare providers, or local privileges to certain people in certain occupations. Those types of things really do stand in the way of upward mobility for many people.
I think it's really interesting that you bring up the slavery example and how you connect that to government privilege because it's something that people often connect with government privilege, but they don't look at the economic side of it and how other people, the people in slavery, were deeply affected by this government favoritism. I think it's a good way to kind of connect what people already know to an issue like cronyism that people don't really understand if they're not economists. I think that's okay. So now I want to drill down a few examples of cronyism, specifically Certificate of Needs regulations or con laws.
Sure.
Until I talked to you a few years ago when you helped me with the data on a paper I was writing for my math class, I had no idea what con laws were. The first thing I learned is that, quote, con laws require healthcare providers wishing to open or expand a healthcare facility to first prove to a regulatory body that the community needs the planned services, end quote. In other words, let's say you're a doctor and you want to expand your practice and you want to add more specialists or more equipment. You first have to ask the government for permission to do so. Worst of all, when you ask the government for permission, you have to ask a committee made of your peers, basically everyone that you're competing against, and they're the ones who have to give you permission to expand your practice. These are state and local rules, correct? Do they
Yeah.
fit in with your work on cronyism?
Yeah, that's right. And you gave a better introduction than I could. And you're absolutely right. These are rules that when I first learned about them, I thought, this is like made up by some straight out of an Ayn Rand novel or something like that. Like this can't really exist, but it does. Unlike other regulations that at least are aimed at assessing a provider's qualifications or safety record or something like that, they don't even aim at that. They're simply second guessing a provider's belief that they think that their community would benefit from a product or a service. And you're absolutely right that they give a quite a bit of um, privilege to existing providers because one, the providers are able to often benefit from the fact that their competitors are not able to receive the cons, but also they have a outsized influence on actually the who gets them and who doesn't. So they sometimes sit on the board. Even if they don't sit on the board, they are invited to go before the board and submit uh, uh, basically protest the application of their would-be competitors. So it's a pretty extraordinary policy, and I do think it fits right in with this general theme of favoritism and privilege because it is this exorbitant privilege to existing providers. It's ostensibly supposed to protect consumers and taxpayers, but really it just protects them from competition.
Can you tell us a bit about how con laws came to be and what they were meant to achieve?
Yeah, so they were started in the States. I think New York was the first one in the 60s, but they got a real big boost in the 70s through a federal law, 1974 National Health Planning and Resources Development Act. And this was a federal statute that basically withheld federal funds from states unless they created con programs. And it's really fascinating if you're a masochist and like to read federal legislation. It's fascinating to go look at that piece of legislation because it says that right there in the first few pages, it basically says, we've really messed up. The government has intervened in healthcare in so many ways that we have really screwed up this market. And so, as a result of that, we should intervene more. So the basic concern was that, well, we've got all these problems like a third party payer problem, and the federal government pays for most spending. And so people are really divorced from these market signals. And so there's this concern that maybe doctors might order procedures, unnecessary procedures, um, whether patients need them or not. And so, in order to keep them from doing that, we're going to limit their capacity. So, if we're worried about people putting um, patients in beds unnecessarily, we can maybe correct that by just eliminating beds. So
That
that's the basic idea.
Yeah, that's I don't know. Can
Oh,
you
great.
tell us about the effects of these laws and if they achieve their goals?
Yes, they do not achieve their goals. So the other thing about that federal statute is it's pretty explicit about what they wanted to have happen. They wanted these laws to um, decrease the cost of care. They wanted them to increase. Actually, let me take them one at a time and talk about the economics of it too. So first, they wanted to decrease the cost of care. Now, there's a podcast, but if you imagine a supply and demand diagram, if I'm drawing it in the air, it's pretty weird that you would expect a supply restriction to decrease cost. Under most, basic Econ 101 models, a supply restriction should be predicted to raise cost, and that's actually what we find happens. The next goal was to increase the capacity for care. This one's just patently bizarre. How can you increase care by decreasing the supply of care? It doesn't really make sense. And that's probably the one where there's the strongest amount of evidence. So we find that con laws are associated with fewer hospitals per capita, quite a bit fewer, about 30% fewer. They're associated with
Wow.
fewer ambulatory surgery centers per capita, fewer hospice care facilities, fewer rural hospitals and rural ambulatory surgery centers, um, fewer dialysis clinics. You find that patients in states with con laws have to travel longer distances in order to obtain care. Um, they're more likely to leave their state in search of care. There are fewer hospitals offering MRIs, CT, and PET scans. There are fewer hospital beds. I've just done a study that looks at the projections for ICU bed shortages during COVID, and we find that states that require a con law for a hospital bed, they're about twice as likely to experience these types of shortages, and the shortages that they do experience are much larger. They're about 8,000, a shortage of 8,000 beds rather than, in con states, rather than a shortage of 100 beds or so in non-con states. So that's really the overwhelming evidence, is that they really do limit capacity. And then they also hope that these things would increase quality. They sort of wave their hands about how and why that would happen. Over the years, they've come up with a few different rationales, but the evidence suggests that they don't. In fact, there are higher readmission rates following heart attack, heart failure, and pneumonia. There's higher mortality rates in con states. There's lower patient satisfaction. There's higher levels of post-surgery complications. So these quality differences are kind of small, but they are real lives, and it is statistically significant. So basically, across the board, they don't seem to achieve any of the goals that their advocates say that they should achieve.
So last year, when I wrote my math paper, I was trying to see the impact of con laws on specifically the number of opioid deaths because we'd been talking about that often in school and like
Mhm.
opioid overdoses, the crisis, all of that. So I looked specifically at the impact on opioid deaths of states that had con laws in general, like any type of con law, states with con laws specifically about calling ambulances and having ambulances available,
Uh-huh.
and states with con laws specifically about drug rehabilitation and drug rehabilitation centers. So the results kind of showed that the general con laws, like ones just having con laws in general, not even having specific ones that related to drug rehabilitation, didn't have any sort of significant connection. But that makes sense. The ambulance con laws and the drug rehabilitation con laws had a more significant impact on opioid death rates. Specifically, ambulance con laws had like a large impact. And I couldn't really control for more factors when I did the math and kind of crunched the numbers for the paper.
Mhm.
But if I could have, I think based on a lot of what you've said and the research that I've done, that it would show that the strong connection would still be there and that these con laws kind of, as you've been saying, block access to care and do the opposite of what they're supposed to do. So, leaving aside the pandemic that we're in, can you tell us the consequences that the con laws have compared to other states that don't have them?
Yeah. Well, and I think your intuition is right. That certainly wouldn't surprise me. So, one thing I always try to point out whenever I talk to state legislators, they hear a lot from hospital associations and others who benefit from con. And so they've got a certain set number of talking points. And one of them is sort of just fear. They'll say things like, we just don't know what could happen. It's too risky. Um, and, our state is different. Well, my response to that is usually, we kind of do know what'll happen. Not only do we have economic theory with all these consistent predictions that say that if you increase competition, that you will have higher quality, lower cost, and greater access, but we also have the experience of the last 30 years. So that about 40% of the U.S. population lives in a state with no certificate of need law in healthcare. These are poor states, they're rich states, they're urban, they're rural, they're coastal, they're intercontinental, they're all kinds of different states. And in fact, we can gather data on demographics and economic conditions and underlying health characteristics in those states and compare outcomes in con and non-con states. And what we find is not only do patients are we spending more per patient per year in con states relative to non-con states, but we're also those patients have less access to care. All the data that all the stats that I rattled off earlier,
Mhm.
and we also find that they tend to have worse outcomes in terms of higher mortality rates and readmission rates and lower patient satisfaction rates. So really across the board, the experience suggests that economic theory is right on here, that greater competition actually seems to improve patient outcomes.
So, in the last few weeks, you've done a lot of work specifically about how con laws have prevented us to prepare and respond to the coronavirus pandemic crisis. You know, can you tell us about that? I mean, earlier you talked about how it decreases the amount of hospital beds available in con states, but what else?
Yeah, so we gathered data from it's widely cited data on ICU bed shortages, and it's collected by the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. And what they've done is they've projected the expected number of hospital bed shortages around the country. And what they find is nationwide, their projection was that there's going to be a peak of about 9,000 bed shortages, but that those shortages are really not a national phenomenon. They are mostly limited to a few states. And in most states, they're not projecting a shortage at all. Now, here's the interesting thing: is that among those states, I think it's 11 states in total that are projected to experience a shortage. Um, they are overwhelmingly certificate of need states, or states specifically that require a certificate of need for hospital beds. So what we find is that the typical non-con state, the state with no certificate of need law for hospital beds, there's about a 30% or 13% probability that they'll experience a shortage during COVID. But in con states, states that require a con for a hospital bed, it's a 30% chance of experiencing a shortage. So it's more than twice as likely to experience a shortage if you live in a con state versus a non-con state. And the shortages are much larger. So, in the typical non con state, they're expecting over the whole course of the crisis to be short of about 114 beds. But in the typical con state, they're expecting to be short by about over 8,000 beds. So it's quite a big difference. And then to put that in perspective in terms of um, the number of people, the typical non-con state is expecting to be short by about less than one bed per 10,000 residents, just a little over half a bed per 10,000 residents. But among con states, it's more than 9 beds per 10,000 residents over the course of the crisis. So these are quite large numbers, and they're consistent and robust, even if when you control for all sorts of other factors, including demographics, the underlying health characteristics, the economics of each state. So this is a problem not just in normal times, but it's an acute problem during the pandemic.
And it seems like there's significant data that all signs kind of point to dismantling these laws. So are you hopeful that we'll get rid of them?
Well, okay, so under normal times, I'm not particularly hopeful, just because the go back to the beginning of our conversation. You said you'd never heard of these things, and you're well educated. I had never heard of these things before I started researching them, and I think most people don't know that these things exist. However, those who benefit from them, and clearly hospitals do benefit from them, they lobby quite hard for them. They are well aware that they exist. They know how they work, and they do everything that they can to try to maintain them. So, under normal circumstances, I would say that the deck is stacked towards keeping these laws around. But these are not normal times. So what's kind of interesting about this crisis is it's shown a really big spotlight on these laws and brought them to light to people who didn't know that they existed. And it's not just these laws, but also other laws like scope of practice rules, barriers to telemedicine, um, even FDA functions. People, I think, are more aware of these of counterproductive and anti-competitive regulations than ever. So I am cautiously optimistic that this may be an opportunity really to roll back some of these bad rules.
So now I kind of want to take a turn and talk about occupational licensing. Similar to con laws, well, not similar, but they're like con laws.
Mm-hmm.
They have there's state and local rules. It's the practice of requiring government approval before an individual can legally earn a living for doing a job or for a profession that they have. So, for instance, if you wanted to be a doctor, you have to go to school, but you also have to get a license before you're allowed to practice, before you're allowed to make your services available. That makes sense to a lot of people, but today the government requires a license for things like being an interior designer or giving manicures. In fact, the past rules were pretty much only professions that were considered high risk. And now over a third of all professions require licenses, many of which, like hair braiding, are very, very low risk for consumers. Can you tell us why occupational licensing fits into your government favoritism portfolio and why we should care about them?
Sure, absolutely. So maybe the best way to do this is to tell you a story about a young entrepreneur. Actually, I would consider her young because she's my age. So Melanie Armstrong is a mother of four from Tupelo, Mississippi, who had a dream of opening her own African American hair braiding business. And not only did she want to do that, but she actually wanted to open up a school where she taught other women to braid hair. So she set up shop, started braiding hair, and then started teaching people how to braid hair. And she got in the letter a cease and desist notice. They said, "Sorry, you are practicing cosmetology without a license. Now, cosmetology, as the term comes from cosmetics, this generally has to do with the application of makeup, right? And she said, "Well, I'm not really doing any cosmetology. I think you're mistaken." And they said, "No, no, that's considered cosmetology. You have to go to school and spend thousands of dollars getting an education in cosmetology, years doing it. You have to apprentice and take tests. And oh, by the way, as it turns out, when you look into what the schools teach, they don't teach anything about braiding hair whatsoever." So,
Wow, helpful.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So you look at this and you say, how in the world does this exist? Is there a big push by consumers, where a lot of people got really bad hair braiding experiences and just demanded that the government step in? And the answer is no. In the vast majority of cases, the expansion of this of occupational licensure has happened not because consumers have been burned by a bad experience, but because those who are already in business want to limit the entrance of new competitors. So it's really, and actually, that's what the evidence suggests. It doesn't seem to benefit consumers, but it definitely does harm competition.
So, can you tell us about the impact of occupational licensing on lower income Americans?
Yeah, so it turns out this can happen through a number of different channels, but as it turns out, it has a disparate impact on certain communities. So, one way it can do that is because it raises costs, and the typical profession that is licensed is often a larger share of the budget for low income people. So, we're talking about barbers, land, hair and beauty products, other types of professions that, at least as a share of income, are a pretty significant portion. But the other thing is that it often affects, on the supply side, on the side of people trying to get work, it affects certain professions that tend to be low income. So in this, it can affect landscapers, it can affect construction, electricians, plumbing, that sort of thing. So studies have found that licensure seems to have what's called a disparate impact, or a greater effect on certain populations. So, for example, those for whom English is a second language tend to have a difficult time getting licenses because there's often a language proficiency exam. In some cases, there's a legal proficiency exam. So you don't just need to know the English language; you need to know legalese, which many of us don't know. Then there are the requirements that say you have to live in the state for a certain period of time. Well, that tends to affect those who have recently moved, or immigrants, or certain populations like military spouses who tend to move around a lot. Um, then there are rules that affect those who have prior convictions. So there, in many states, there are rules that say that boards can deny a license to anybody who has a prior conviction, or even anybody. There's sort of vague terminology. Anybody who has uh, for moral concerns, but it's sort of in the eye of the beholder, of the regulator, in terms of what exactly is a moral problem here. So what you find is about 80% of the studies that have looked at the connection between um, occupational licensure and minorities, actually, excuse me, 67% of the studies find a disparate impact on minorities. They find that these rules are more likely to harm African Americans, Hispanics, Asians than other majority populations.
Wow. So, along with Adam Thier, who I would love to interview on this podcast,
Would be
you have
great.
highlighted many different ways that technology has helped consumers to get more information and better information about product and service safety than with occupational licensing. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah. So first of all, let me kind of present a little bit of the evidence on licensure and quality. So, you would think it's easy to tell a story about how licensure might increase quality. I think if you walk up to a lot of people on the street and you say, "Is licensure help increase the quality of products or services?" And I think a lot of people would say, "Yeah, it must, right?" They require you to have a certain amount of education and take tests and have some experience. But on the other hand, there are other good theories that suggest it might undermine quality. So, for one, we know it undermines competition, and competition itself tends to be one of the greatest um, guarantors of quality. Um, Two, we know it raises prices by about. It can vary from profession to profession, but the best estimate is somewhere between 5 and 25%. So uh, if it increases prices, then it may cause consumers to either forego the service altogether or maybe even to do it themselves. So there's some interesting and sort of disturbing examples where greater stringency of licensure is associated with people, for example, resorting to do it yourself electrician services, right? So, I have no business installing any electrical equipment in my house. But as it turns out, that states and regions that have higher um, barriers to occupational licensure for electricians, um, people seem to do more do-it-yourself electrician jobs, and actually electrocutions are higher in those states relative to other states. There's also evidence that people skip eye exams. There's evidence and have worse eye health, that they skip dental exams and have worse dental oral health. So it can happen a number of different ways. So let's turn to the data. What are the empirics find? Well, it turns out it's been well studied. There's been dozens of studies over the years. A majority of them, 57%, really find no effect whatsoever of licensure on quality. They're either unclear, mixed, or they may be neutral effects. Interestingly, so 11% of studies do find a positive effect. I think one of the main areas where they found a positive effect of licensure on quality was in midwives. But three times as many studies, 32%, found a negative effect, that licensure actually undermines quality. So, if anything, licensure is more likely to undermine the quality or the safety of a product or service than it is to enhance it.
But also having a midwife, that's more high risk, you would think, than like hair braiding.
Yeah.
So,
Right. That's right. And you can see where there may be some professions where it's just the goal should be to say what is the higher. Not only is this a high risk profession that maybe the state has a role, but also is licensure rationally connected? Is there some evidence that it seems to increase quality, and that we think it'll actually keep you safe? I realized I never did answer your underlying question, which is, if not licensure, what else? And I would argue that there's a lot of other private mechanisms, especially now that we have improved technology, that are more likely to keep people safe. So, one of these, of course, is the internet, and you can go to Google, or you can go to Yelp, and you can see how previous customers have experienced a certain provider. A recent NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research study, found that most people actually turn to those types of sources of information rather than to licensure. Um, but beyond that, there are things like insurance. Insurance companies have a strong incentive to make sure that those whom they insure are of high quality, so they have their own types of quality metrics. There are things practices like posting bonds, where a electrician or a plumber who could potentially come into your house and do some damage to your house, they will go to a bank and they'll post a bond, a $10,000 or $20,000 bond, that they automatically forfeit in the event that they cause damage to your house. Even in the case of healthcare, that's one where people say it's probably the furthest down on the list in terms of deregulation for many people. But one of the things I like to point out is that even in healthcare, I really don't think licensure is what keeps you safe. In most states, a licensed psychiatrist is, as far as the state is concerned, able to perform surgery on you. That doesn't mean that they should, and in most cases they don't. And the reason is not because of licensure, but because of other things. They have medical malpractice concerns. They're not going to be able to get medical malpractice insurance if they routinely practice way outside the scope of their competency. They are not going to lose their hospital privileges if the hospital finds out that they're doing things outside the scope of their competency. Um, they are concerned about liability and reputation. There's all sorts of other types of mechanisms, in my view, that really are much more important in keeping people safe than licensure.
So, can you tell us about what's happened on the occupational licensing front since the beginning of the pandemic? I know that many states have dropped licensing requirements on many professions, but what I think about is if these rules aren't helpful when we're in an emergency, do we need them at all?
Yeah, certainly raises a question. Yeah, the most common thing that states have done is not necessarily to drop them altogether, but to ease them. So many states have done one thing that they've done is to ease what's called scope of practice. And basically, scope of practice is the guidelines around what a licensed professional can do. It's particularly relevant in healthcare. So, there's nurse practitioners and other types of highly trained nursing professionals, physician's assistants, nurse anesthetists, those types of professions. They need a license, and there are certain guidelines about what they can do within that. And so, for example, in many states, a nurse practitioner can't really independently practice without a physician signing off on everything that they must do. And a lot of states have eased those rules because, and I think it makes sense in normal times. We don't find that more relaxed scope of practice rules are associated with any worse health outcomes. We do find that they are associated with cheaper care. It's easier to obtain access, and you can obtain access to lower cost care when a nurse practitioner can see you rather than a physician. And it also frees up physicians to focus on more um, serious conditions. So a lot of states have eased those types of rules. Another move that they've made is to recognize licenses from out of state or even from out of the country. I live in New Mexico, and New Mexico has permitted nurses from Canada to practice freely within the state during the coronavirus. So we're sort of undergoing this strange experiment in the United States where, on a lot of dimensions, of course, government is growing larger, but on many dimensions, particularly in regulations, we're also seeing lots and lots of rules being relaxed or eased. I think ATR, Americans for Tax Reform, has kept a running tab, and they're up to 400 relaxed or suspended regulations waived in order to help fight COVID-19.
Wow. Are you hopeful at the chance to get rid of occupational licensing laws?
I actually think we're in a bit of a moment, even outside the COVID-19 crisis, in which occupational licensing laws are under greater scrutiny than ever. So my usual pessimism does apply. The same thing that I said about certificate of need applies here. Most people don't really know about these rules, and those who bear the costs of them are particularly ignorant. But the incumbent providers who benefit from them do know about them, and they lobby for them. But nevertheless, the last 2 years, states across the country have been moving, I think, in a good direction in terms of licensure. Some of this actually is really a lot of credit goes to the Obama administration. Back in 2015, they issued a report on occupational licensure in which they looked at the literature and found, geez, sure enough, this doesn't seem to increase quality or safety. It does seem to raise prices, and it seems to have a disparate impact on minorities. Maybe we ought to get rid of them. And so they have pushed pushed a lot of the states to consider reforms, and I think those are starting to bear fruit today as states have been sort of cautiously liberalizing some of their occupational licensing rules over the last few years, and it's only accelerated with COVID-19.
Well, that is good to hear. This was a great conversation. It's been an honor talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I am so delighted, and I'm really excited about all the attention and success you've had. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.